Hello, my name is Daniel Smullen, and today I'll be presenting our work titled Managing Potentially Intrusive Practices in the Browser, a User-Centered Perspective. Today, web browsing is a really tricky situation because on different websites there's many different data practices, and not everybody feels the same way about them. Some people see practices as good. They can make browsing safer, more relevant, potentially even more useful. And some practices can be seen as bad. Some people see them as intrusive or too complex, and they can be difficult to understand. In this work, we use the term potentially intrusive practices to generically refer to common third-party tracking methods. This includes fingerprinting, as well as other types of scripts that run in the browser to collect data, monitor activity, redirect users' attention, or operate in the background to gather something of value. But note, in our study, we referred to these practices neutrally, using terminology such as web technologies, and I'll discuss more about why we did that a little later. Fundamentally, whether or not an intrusive practice is a problem for you depends on many factors. It can depend on your preferences, or the type of website you're browsing, or what you're doing there, as well as how security and privacy conscious you are, your confidence in the ability to control data practices, and even what you actually have control over, as well as potentially many more factors. But where harms occur is when your expectations don't match with your browsing experience. So being able to manage what you're okay or not okay with is really crucial. So that's why the aim of the study is to understand what users want, what they actually get, and to find ways to fill the gap between the two. Therefore, we focused on a few key research questions. First, what are the signals that users rely on to determine that they're being subjected to intrusive practices or being protected from them? Second, what affordances do users associate with enabling or disabling these practices? Third, are there practices that users would want to control, such as opting in or opting out of them, and subject to what kind of contextual attributes? And finally, what practices do users prefer to be notified about, how often, and in what sorts of contexts? For example, are there differences between popular or less popular websites, or different website categories? We employed a methodology which can be summarized as follows. First, we created a taxonomy of potentially intrusive practices, using both technical definitions for internal use in order to remain technically consistent, and also with non-technical definitions that we used in our survey instruments that would be suitable for laypersons without them having to understand all the details. These also included descriptions of risks and benefits, all with neutral language. These descriptions also underwent further analysis by focus groups and were also tested in pilot studies. We used these definitions to create a qualitative survey where we collected information about where users had encountered them, what they'd done about them, and how they recognized the different practices. And these results underwent grounded analysis, which then informed the creation of a large-scale quantitative survey where we collected people's preferences to opt out of these different practices among different contexts. This large-scale corpus of preferences was then used to evaluate alternative settings, which could hopefully offer better results in terms of more accurate settings with less user burden associated with them than what are currently offered across different websites and different browsers. The taxonomy of potentially intrusive practices included the following practices seen here, ranging from identity sign-in services, such as sign-in with Google and so on, all the way down to targeted advertising, behavioral profiling, reporting and analytics, fingerprinting, nag screens, session replay, and crypto mining. And for each of these practices, we asked questions about them in different contexts. Different website categories such as news, entertainment, shopping, travel, finance, adult, health, and social media. And for each of these website categories, we showed examples of popular websites as well as unpopular websites across each of these different categories. However, there were some important methodological considerations when we went about doing this study. As mentioned earlier, it was crucially important that we mitigated bias as much as possible by using neutral language. We didn't want to impart our own bias as researchers. We also found that, amongst ourselves, we often felt quite negatively towards these practices, and it was really important that we didn't prime our participants accordingly. However, there were instances where we did want to prime the participants on purpose. For example, we wanted to make sure that they understood what the different websites were among the different categories. Therefore, we provided them with screenshots as well as other information about the websites, such as where they were based, when they were created, and so on. And we also wanted to prime them about the different categories of practices to make sure that it was clear based on the definitions that we'd created for them earlier. Finally, we employed randomization wherever possible in order to mitigate learning effects, such as among the ordering of different website categories and showing popular versus unpopular websites in particular order. So what did we find? Well, here's a brief summary of the results from our grounded analysis, which we organized into the key themes you can see here. But the ones that I'll focus on for this presentation are demonstrating understanding and misinterpreted signals. When it comes to demonstrating understanding, what we found was that a majority of our participants, 74%, were able to demonstrate a clear understanding of the potential risks and benefits of the practices that we showed them based on their descriptions. However, we also found that our participants mentioned benefits of practices without us having prompted them, even though we later provided them with both examples of risks and benefits. So for instance, when it came to nag screens, our participants mentioned that nag screens could draw their attention to important items of interest, even if they did find the nag screens annoying. When it came to fingerprinting, participants mentioned that it could be used to potentially secure their accounts, which they saw as important, especially on financial websites, for example. We also saw evidence of misinterpreted signals, such as in the following quote. Well, with the ad blocker or script blocker program, I know I successfully opted out because I don't receive any ads at all. And with the script blocker, I'm pretty sure the website isn't receiving any information from me based off my limited knowledge of the program. Same goes for private browsing, I guess. So, is this participant suggesting that no ads on the website means that there aren't any intrusive practices to worry about? We saw evidence of a similar pattern such as this one in many of our participants' responses. We also saw evidence that most people want to deny intrusive practices most of the time, which is clearly seen in this table summarizing those results. Also, you can note that fingerprinting has a slightly lower level of preference to deny overall, which is likely explained by the focus on benefits that we saw as mentioned earlier. But what if the settings work differently? What would that be like? In this study, we also wanted to explore, based on the corpus of preferences, whether we might be able to improve upon the settings that are offered in a patchwork between websites and browsers. However, when evaluating these alternative settings, it was really important to focus on the two key measurements of whether these alternative settings were better. The first measurement is accuracy, meaning in what percentage of scenarios do the settings enable users to align the practices that they're subjected to with their preferences. After all, not all models of alternative settings would enable users to get the granular settings that they were looking for. Also, we evaluated user burden, meaning how many individual settings need to be changed for the user to get the settings that they actually wanted. And we'll note that the maximum measurement of user burden was determined by the number of websites we surveyed. Since we surveyed 16 websites across 8 different categories, 16 would be the maximum value of user burden. And what we found in terms of accuracy looks like this. When we start with the first no toggle allow model, we're referring to essentially what's offered by Chrome, where all of the different practices are allowed and there aren't any settings available to deny them. Next, when we look at no toggle deny, this is what is most similar to strict mode in most browsers, where all of the settings are denied with no further settings offered. You can see here that the accuracy substantially increases between the no toggle allow and the no toggle deny, and this is easily explained by the proportion of participants that we saw preferring to opt out in general. But when we look at the other two models, category toggles and website toggles, this allowed us to answer two different sets of questions. With category toggles, we're answering the question of what if browsers offered comprehensive settings that were based on website categories, and you can see that this results in a substantially higher accuracy. Then, when we look at individual website toggles, that's answering the question of what if every website offered comprehensive settings, allowing participants to allow or deny each of these data practices across every individual website, which is not currently offered. Of course, this would allow 100% accuracy, since in every scenario, there's a choice available for the user to change the setting to what they want. But measuring only the accuracy gives only half of the picture. And so user burden is also important to evaluate these alternative settings, because these different models offer wildly different amounts of burden. You can see that the no toggle allow default is actually what we're currently considering to be the default, and therefore has no user burden associated with it. And it only takes one setting change to move from this setting to no toggle deny. But when we also take a look at the different default settings among category toggles and website toggles, we noticed a pattern where the allow by default settings were substantially more burdensome. And then, of course, on the flip side, the deny by default settings were substantially less burdensome. So when we consider the trade-off between the amount of user burden associated with configuring these different models, and then reconcile that with the level of accuracy that we get, we can see that there's some improvements to be made. The no toggle deny settings overall give a good improvement in accuracy, but still only about 75% overall. So this is a reasonable trade-off, especially considering that there's a very low level of user burden. But we certainly can do much better than that. After all, the category toggles with deny by default offered roughly 92% average accuracy, and yet also have a very low level of user burden associated with them. So we recognize that this might potentially be an optimal trade-off. So the key takeaways from this particular part of our study were as follows. Deny by default settings are much closer to what people want, and we could clearly see this earlier when people expressed their preferences to opt out. But we also see here that deny by default is less burdensome. People need to make less decisions and need to change less settings when we have deny by default settings. We also see, however, that individual website settings are simply too burdensome. If we offered settings across every single website, which is not currently offered, it's still better than the situation where people don't have any choice at all, but we're simply offering them far too many choices, particularly if we're doing allow by default settings. Therefore, standard settings, which are based on website categories, would likely be much easier to configure, but would still retain very high accuracy. But there's still a problem, and that problem is website breakage and misaligned incentives. You see, as I mentioned earlier, websites only offer a patchwork of different options, and so if we were to ensure that websites each offered comprehensive options for controlling all of the different practices we described in our study, it would create a large amount of additional burden. But a single place to configure these preferences would be far more ideal, rather than forcing people to reconfigure these preferences on individual websites as they browse the web. So let's make the settings standard. If they're configured the same way and applied everywhere, it would certainly be a big improvement for users. But would it? Unfortunately, it's just not that simple. Standards such as do not track and other similar voluntary standards have failed, as they're often not respected by different individual websites. And the reason why this happens is because websites have different incentives than browsers, or different incentives from users. Websites could potentially break when people try to enact their preferences, but then blame the user just because they're trying to take back control. What we need then is standards that websites will comply with in order to prevent the situation where people get punished just for simply enacting their preferences. So to summarize, people have different levels of appreciation for the risks and benefits of different practices, even if they don't understand all the different technical details. And what we found was that there's relationships between people's opt-out preferences, the types of practices, and the types of websites, which suggests that one-size-fits-all settings really can't satisfy everyone. We also found that most people want to opt out, and they assume that settings must exist, whether it's in their browser or on websites, but they have a hard time finding them, typically because they don't actually exist, and this results in a lot of frustration. People also want to be notified about the practices that exist on different sites, but they're misled by what they see when they're browsing, particularly when it comes to things like ads. And what results is a misalignment between the control that people expect over potentially intrusive practices and what they're actually getting when they're browsing. We believe then that standard settings have the potential to help. They could be both more accurate than one-size-fits-all preferences and also be less burdensome than offering settings individually across every different website for every different practice. So to find out more about this research, we invite you to check out privacyassistant.org for the Personalized Privacy Assistant project, as well as our paper. And we'd like to thank Dr. Steve Engelhardt and Professor Alessandra Acquisti for their helpful suggestions with this work. We also want to acknowledge that this work was supported in part by grants from the following organizations: Mozilla, DARPA, the Air Force Research Laboratory, and the National Science Foundation. If you'd like to contact us to find out more about this work, please feel free to get in touch with us using the contact information seen here. The corresponding authors for this paper are marked with an asterisk and are shaded in gray. Thanks very much for your attention.